everyone, I'm Megan Sullivan, and welcome back to History in Games, a video and audio podcast where we celebrate the hidden history found in our favorite video games. In this episode, we're doing a deep dive on Kai, one of the four main protagonists in Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. First, we'll look at Kai, the Fire Emblem character, and go over some exciting details fans have noticed about him during the reveal trailer. Then we'll discuss how Kai may be tied to Sir Kai or Sir Kay, a legendary Welsh hero famous for being one of the Knights of the Round Table. And finally, saving the best for last, we'll be looking at the real historical figures and events that tie Kai to the late Roman Empire, which has been the main subject of this series. And I have to say, I was super surprised by where this history lesson took me, and I think you will be too. By the way, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my other videos on the secret history of Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. Alright, let's get started. So who is Kai? Well, we know that Kai is one of the four main characters participating in the Daxian Games, and that he wants to win the games so that he can ask the Divine Sovereign to release his father from prison. We also know that Kai enjoys hanging out with his glasses-wearing friend, can ride a flying Orneus, and can trigger the skill Knightly Senses in battle, which seems to give him a big crit boost. We even see Kai's national banner is a blue sun symbol, though which faction or nation this represents isn't yet clear. But here's the most interesting thing about Kai. In one scene where Kai is fighting a charioteer, you can see that right before Kai attacks, the crest of Aubin briefly flashes on the screen. This is the same crest wielded by the character Yuri in Fire Emblem Three Houses. Now, if you've played Fire Emblem Three Houses, you know that the only way to wield the power of a magical crest is to either be the descendant of a crest wielder or be given the blood of a dragon, which is how Yuri received his crest. Does this mean that Kai is a distant relative of Yuri, or was he given dragon's blood at some point? I guess we'll have to wait and see, but this seems like a significant detail. But what about the name Kai? It has to have some significance too, right? After all, we've already established that the names Theodora, Lita, and Diedrich all have historical ties to the late Roman Empire, which aesthetically at least seems to be the inspiration for Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. This Roman connection is what led me to believe that Kai could be short for Caesar or Kaiser, which by late antiquity was a junior ruler or heir apparent to the Augustus, the emperor. And that still could be the case, but a viewer pointed out to me that Kai could actually stand for Caius, or Kai, or Kay, one of the legendary Knights of the Round Table from Arthurian legend, which is a blend of Celtic mythology, something that pops up a lot in Fire Emblem, and real historical events that took place during the late Roman period. And I thought that was inspired. So let's explore that angle further. For those who don't know, Arthurian legend is a series of knightly tales that evolved over the course of Europe's medieval period from about the 5th to the 15th century. These stories are a mix of Celtic mythology, quasi-British history, Plantagenet propaganda, and French romance. There are numerous versions of the Arthurian legend, including the most famous version, Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century masterpiece, La Mort d'Arthur, which recounts the rise and fall of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, a chivalric order dedicated to maintaining peace throughout the kingdom of Camelot. In these tales, the Knights of the Round Table go on all sorts of adventures, involving giants, dragons, dwarves, wizards, magical maidens, knightly tournaments, a sword in the stone, a quest for the Holy Grail, a scandalous love affair or two, and the occasional fight with real historical figures like the Anglo-Saxons and the ancient Romans. It's exciting stuff, and Sir Kay just happens to be at the center of it all. According to the earliest surviving sources of Arthurian legend, preserved in fragments of Welsh poetry, Sir Kay, sometimes called Sir Kai or Sir Caius, was a powerful knight with magical qualities. He could grow as tall as the tallest tree, he could hold his breath and get zero sleep for 9 days straight, he could radiate supernatural heat from his hands, and nobody could brave fire and water as well as he. Oh, and much like Diedrich von Bern, whom I covered earlier in this series, Kai's sword always dealt a mortal blow. Because of that, Sir Kay wasn't afraid of anyone or anything, and had no problems doing battle with a monstrous cat, over half a dozen witches, and even a giant. One Welsh poem preserved in a 13th century manuscript describes Kay as thus: Prince of the plunder, the unrelenting warrior to his enemy, heavy was he in his vengeance, terrible was he in his fighting. When he would drink from a horn, he would drink as much as 4. When into battle he came, he slew as would 100. As the legend of King Arthur evolved, however, Kay lost most of his magical abilities and gained quite a violent temper and biting wit. In fact, by the late Middle Ages, Kay was somewhat of a boorish brute. But even then, he was known for his unwavering loyalty to his foster brother Arthur, which is why he was chosen to be the king's seneschal, aka his senior servant. And that in turn is why Kay's heraldry depicts two keys on a blue field. And this banner would have been seen flying over any territory that belonged to Sir Kay. For example, it would have been seen flying over the ancient Roman fort of Caergae in Wales, which apparently Kay commanded, and the town of Chinon, which he apparently founded, and over the entirety of Anjou in modern-day France, which King Arthur made him Duke of. In short, Kay's story, and by extension Arthurian legend, is a strange mix of high fantasy and history. Which begs the question, how did Sir Kay and King Arthur end up with one foot in fantasy and one foot in fact? Well, in order to understand how that happened, we have to take a closer look at the source most responsible for Arthurian lore getting tangled up in history: Geoffrey of Monmouth's seminal 12th century work, The History of the Kings of Britain. This historical account is based on two categorically different sources. The first source is a series of earlier historical works like On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain by the 6th century monk Gildas, Bede's 8th century work, The Ecclesiastical History of the British People, The History of the Britons, a 9th century work attributed to a monk named Nennius, and the 10th century work, The Annals of Wales. The second source is a collection of Welsh documents that include Welsh genealogy lists, kings lists, ancient poems, ancient folklore, and even works related to the lives of Welsh saints. Oh, and apparently a mysterious book given to Geoffrey of Monmouth by a bishop named Walter, although that book mysteriously disappeared. The end result is a fascinating quasi-history of Britain that covers British history from its mythical founding by a hero named Brutus of Troy all the way up until the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England in the 7th century. King Arthur and Sir Kay's activities only take up a small portion of a much larger narrative, but their story was so interesting that later medieval authors like Robert Wace, Laomon, Crétin de Troyes, and Sir Thomas Malory would all go on to rewrite Arthur's history and add their own flourishes to the tale, like a round table and a quest for the Holy Grail. But all of that comes after the history of the kings of Britain. And here, I'm going to take the opportunity to quickly summarize Arthur's story as related to us by Geoffrey of Monmouth. According to the history of the kings of Britain, Arthur was a 6th century British king who managed to fend off the Saxons, a Germanic tribe that had invaded Britannia, that is Britain, a generation before. Well, technically they were invited by a usurper king named Vortigern, but never mind. After saving his people from the Saxons, King Arthur went on to defeat his enemies abroad and ended up conquering Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and even Roman Gaul, aka modern-day France. Then, after fighting a giant for some reason, Arthur went on to defeat a fictitious Roman emperor named Lucius Tiberius, sometimes written as Lucius Hiberius, at the Battle of Soissons in Gaul, which is where Sir Kay and a number of Arthur's best knights were mortally wounded. After that, Arthur planned to march against another real emperor named Leo, but he was forced to abandon his plans in order to suppress a rebellion started by his nephew, Mordred. Although Arthur managed to kill Mordred at the Battle of Winchester, the king himself was grievously wounded and taken to a place called Avalon. But strangely, Geoffrey of Monmouth never says whether or not Arthur actually recovered from his wounds. All we know is that after that, Arthur's cousin Constantine became King of the Britons, though many of the British still believed that perhaps one day Arthur would return to save them from their troubles, which is why he was called the Once and Future King. And that's the short version of events. Now, what's interesting is that while later writers were happy to embellish on Arthur and Kay's adventures, historians writing before Geoffrey of Monmouth hardly mention Arthur or Kay at all. In fact, before the 9th century, both men were resigned to the misty realm of Welsh folklore, where they fought Saxons and magical cats. It wasn't until the monk Nennius wrote the history of the Britons in the 9th century that we catch a glimpse of a historical figure named Arthur. And this Arthur isn't even a British king. He's described by Nennius as a devout Christian and a devout war chieftain, a dux bellorum, who participated in 12 major battles against the Saxons and may have, at least according to another author, William of Malmesbury, even helped a real historical figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, in his fight against the Saxons. But notice that none of these battles involved the ancient Romans. In fact, there's no mention of Arthur or Sir Kay fighting the Romans until the history of the kings of Britain. But if that's true, where did Geoffrey of Monmouth get his information from? Was there ever a real event involving a British king fighting in Gaul during the reign of a Roman emperor named Leo, where the hero later ended up disappearing near or at a place called Avalon? There is. And we know about this event due to a number of late Roman and early medieval authors, including Jordanus, Sidonius, Apollinaris, and Gregory of Tours. And what's wild is that this historical event not only ties Sir Kay and Arthur to the Roman Empire, but also to the life and times of Diedrich von Bern, aka Theodoric the Great, the subject of our last video. Let me explain. So as I mentioned in the last episode of History and Games, Theodoric the Great was born in the mid-5th century CE, during a very tumultuous time for the Roman Empire. Both halves of the empire were being attacked by a number of barbarian tribes, including the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and worst of all, the Huns, who were especially active in the 440s under Attila the Hun. But even after Attila died in the early 450s, the empire still had to contend with the Vandal king Gaiseric, who not only conquered the Roman port city of Carthage in 439, he also managed to sack Rome in 455, and he was just getting started. In 461, Gaiseric trounced the Western Roman Emperor Majorian in battle, and then in 468, he defeated another Western Emperor, Anthemius, in a huge naval campaign off the coast of North Africa. These military debacles weakened the empire and made it vulnerable to further attack, which other barbarian tribes took full advantage of. One group to do so was Theodoric's tribe, the Ostrogoths, who began attacking Roman territory in the east. This forced the Eastern Roman Emperor, Leo, yes, likely the same Leo that appears in Arthurian legend, to pay them off so they'd stop harassing Roman subjects. In exchange, however, Leo got a valuable hostage, which is how the future Theodoric the Great wound up in the eastern capital of Constantinople. And while he was there, Theodoric would have not only heard about Gaiseric's spectacular naval victory over the Romans, he would have also heard about a Visigoth king named Euric, who was causing trouble in Roman Gaul at the same time Gaiseric was beating up the Roman navy. In order to stop Euric, Anthemius, who was still reeling from his loss to Gaiseric, called on multiple allies to try and halt the Visigoths' advance through Western Europe. These allies included the Franks, the Burgundians, a Roman dux from the territory of Soissons named Syagrius, and finally a mysterious king of the Britons, Riothamos, who according to Jordanus answered the call to war by transporting 12,000 men, quote-unquote, across the ocean. And it's his story that may have inspired Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale of Arthur and Kay's adventures in Gaul. Now, to be clear, the name Riothamos, which in the British language is actually pronounced something like Riothamos, isn't a personal name. It's a title that means something like kingliest or most kingly. And we don't actually know if this kingly king was simply the ruler of the Romano-Britons living in Gaul, or if he was a ruler of the Britons in Britannia. But his superlative name suggests he probably had sway over both territories. But if that's true, it's a little surprising he showed up to the fight. Because at this point, Britannia, a former Roman province, didn't have the strongest relationship with Rome. For centuries, the empire had neglected its British citizens, even though the locals were constantly faced with attacks from a number of Celtic and Germanic tribes, including the Saxons. This imperial neglect ended up causing not one but two Romano-British military commanders, one named Magnus Maximus and another named Constantine, to rise up in revolt in the late 4th century. And what's interesting about these revolts is that both leaders took the fight to the Romans in Gaul, and Magnus Maximus even managed to kill the Emperor Gratian in battle. But in the end, both leaders were executed by Roman forces, and just a few decades later, the remaining Roman legions left Britannia for good. So like I said, the British didn't have the strongest relationship with the empire in the 5th century, but archaeological evidence suggests there were still some trade and diplomatic connections between the two entities, which might be how Anthemius, or perhaps his eastern counterpart Leo, was able to form an alliance with the British king. At any rate, Riothamos showed up to fight for the Roman Empire in Gaul, and at first, he had some success against the Visigoths. But then things went terribly wrong at a place called Deos. There, Riothamos was supposed to link up with the Roman army, which was led by the ruler of Soissons, Syagrius. but either Riothamos arrived at Delos too early or Syagrius arrived too late, because Yorick managed to pounce on the Britons with an overwhelming force before the Romans arrived, and drove the Britons all the way back into neighboring Burgundy, perhaps as far as the Burgundian territory of Avalon. After that, Riothamos just kind of disappears. Meanwhile, Yorick went on to win a bunch more victories and ended up ruling over both the Roman territory of Hispania and southern Gaul until his death in 484. And Rome couldn't stop him because Western Rome was falling apart. In 472, Anthemius was murdered by his own general, after which the throne quickly passed through the hands of 4 more emperors before another general named Odoacer abolished the imperial title and declared himself King of Italy in 476. Although he acknowledged Leo's successor Zeno as the sole emperor of Rome and offered to become his viceroy. And if you recall what happened in the last episode, you know that didn't end so well. Fine, great, but what happened to Riothamos? Why did he disappear? Well, some scholars think he didn't disappear. He just returned to Britannia, where he fought the Saxons under his real name, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a real historical figure mentioned by a number of medieval authors, including St. Gildas, St. Bede, Nennius, William of Malmesbury, and of course, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who actually calls him Aurelius Ambrosius, makes him Arthur's uncle, and has him sail from Gaul to Britannia to take on the Saxons. At any rate, all 5 authors agreed that Ambrosius was highly successful at rallying the Britons and mitigating the Saxon threat in Britannia sometime in either the late 5th or early 6th century, possibly with the help of the, quote, warlike Arthur. And I'm sorry we don't have time to cover that part of history here, but for the purposes of this episode, we're going to stay focused on Kay and Arthur's connection to Rome, which means we need to connect Ambrosius back to Riothamos. Now, linking Ambrosius to Riothamos is pretty controversial, and historians tend to fight over this theory. But there is some compelling evidence they might be the same person. For example, the 9th century monk Nennius calls Ambrosius, quote, king among all the kings of the British nation, which sounds an awful lot like the Latin title Riothamos. And the 8th century monk Bede claims Ambrosius defeated the Saxons in battle during the reign of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, whom we know ruled between 474 and 491. This places Ambrosius Aurelianus in the same general time period as Riothamos. Even more intriguing is how the name Ambrosius Aurelianus is similar to the name Aurelius Ambrosius, father of St. Ambrose of Milan and Roman prefect of Gaul and Britannia in the mid-4th century, meaning Ambrosius Aurelianus, who according to Bede did come from very aristocratic stock, could have had some sort of ancestral connection to Gaul, which would explain his personal interest in defending Gaul against the Visigoth king Yorick. So Ambrosius and Riothamos could be the same person, which leaves us with just one more loose end. And that's the question, if Riothamos is a template for Arthur and Kay's adventures in Gaul, but he fought alongside the Romans and lost a major battle in Gaul, then why did Geoffrey of Monmouth claim Arthur won a major battle in Gaul against a fictitious emperor named Lucius Tiberius? Well, it's more than likely that Geoffrey of Monmouth copy-pasted the more flattering details about Magnus Maximus and a successful revolt against the Emperor Gratian onto Arthur's story, then added a few new details to make Arthur look good. Although, even then, Geoffrey had to admit that Arthur's victory was a hard-fought battle, and that several of Arthur's best knights, including Sir Kay, ended up being slain by the enemy. This could be an echo of the devastating defeat Riothamos suffered at Delos, which apparently is not that close to Soissons, but was supposed to involve Syagrius of Soissons. So again, if you squint, you can see some history poking through here. And here is where our lesson ends. So there it is, Kai's tenuous connection to both Arthurian legend and the late Roman Empire. And now we've covered the history behind all 4 of our new Fire Emblem protagonists. For my next episode, I'm hoping to cover new information about the game as we speed towards its release. So stay tuned for more awesome Fire Emblem history. Thanks so much for supporting History and Games, guys. See you later.